Recording in progress.
I'm going to start by saying greetings to those that have come in early. We're still letting people into the waiting room, so we'll wait just a few more minutes before we start. But thank you so much for joining us. I think this is the second of our Friends of Patronato this year, is it, Kimberly?
Yes.
Welcome to the second.
It's great to see so many people.
Keisha, Desert Watercolors invoice for the amount.
We may need a few people to mute if you're having
You
conversation.
have her email.
Let's see.
I could also give you her.
There we go.
Okay.
Everybody's loading on in.
Lisa could send that to Keisha. I think it's. I don't have her.
I'm going to mute a few people just in case.
There's a lot of people.
All right.
Okay, I'm not sure she's there, but I'll tell her that the invoice will be at the office, and you'll do that next hour or something.
See if I can find who's.
Just to let somebody know, we're actually participating in your office conversation about transferring invoices.
So I think I tried to manually mute everybody. And let's see, got a few more in the waiting room. Everybody's gotten so good at this. We all have. Terrific.
So let's just wait one more minute and then let's begin the formal program.
Hi, Addie. It's fun to see you. Oh, you're going away too. There you are.
Well, Kimberly.
Hi, Joey.
Hi, Kimberly. Why am I not?
Well, you'd have to turn your camera on if you want us to see you.
How do I do that? I don't know everything.
The camera is the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. You'll see a little sort of a video icon.
Thank you.
Have a cross through it.
All right.
I didn't do it.
Sure.
You got 33.
There I am.
Great.
Hi, Kimberly. Nicole is here.
Oh, hey, Nicole. Good to see you. We see lots of friends on here.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
I guess everybody's excited about finding out what's next.
Well, there you go. And we've got Starr Herr-Cardillo here to share that vision along with Miles. And so we're so pleased that you're here. And of course, this is being recorded, and I will send the link once it's uploaded to our YouTube channel in case anyone misses a portion of it or wants to go back and hear more.
So
Yeah, that's really nice of you. Morning, Miles.
how are we doing? At 1:04,
I'm
I
fine.
think
How are you?
we should make a start. So first of all, let me welcome you all to our second Friends of Patronato meeting of the year. And we're particularly excited to share today's vision with you. But before we do that, I just wanted to introduce our team. On the call today, we have Starr Herr-Cardillo checking in from Philadelphia. We have Kimberly Ely checking in from Tucson. And despite the fact that I'm sitting in front of the iconic Mission with its newly preserved East Tower, I'm actually coming to you from deep in the hearts of Nashville, Tennessee. So we really are representing the country far and wide today. I think that you were all aware that we, some years ago, determined that we would invite a team in to come and renew our conservation management plan. And part of that was predicated on us not having a clear vision of what it was going to take to complete the work at the mission. Of course, preservation is forever, but the deferred maintenance, and Starr is going to talk a little bit about what we refer to as deferred maintenance, is something that we've really been chasing to get done for a very long time. We're now an organization that's 4 decades since its inception, and about 3 of those decades have really seen us address major projects on the mission campus. Of course, the iconic artwork on the interior saw the major conservation work in the 90s. And of course, now we are doing catch up, trying to do maintenance of that work. On the exterior of the 18th century church, we've been really working very hard to get rid of all of the Portland cement layers that coated the mission. That was work done in the 40s and 50s, following what seemed like a sensible protocol. But of course, subsequently, we discovered on buildings such as the mission, it was not helpful. In fact, it was harmful. So in fact, the East Tower was the last piece of the work to get rid of the Portland cement plaster renderings from the mission proper. So when I joined the organization in 2015, one of the first questions I started asking was, so what do we project by way of a timeline to complete the work at the mission, and what do we see as the ultimate cost? Because as somebody charged with fundraising to be able to accomplish all of that, I thought it was important to have the answers. And I was told, really nobody had thought that far ahead, that they had really been just working project by project. And at that stage, the work was really solely focused on the 18th century chapel itself, whereas, when Patronato was first formed, a lot of the charge was to take care of the whole mission campus. So one of my early tasks was to use the talents of Bob Vint and then board president to begin coming up with their assessment. Board president, I mean Chuck Albanese, to come up with their assessment of how much they thought would be required, both in time and dollars, to be able to complete the work. And so they went away and did some sums based on the work to date and came up with figures of 20 years and $20 million, which seemed an awesome, but certainly a manageable set of work for us to be able to accomplish. But then subsequent discussions with a number of consultants suggested that maybe the first step in the process of really coming up with tighter numbers would be to call in a team to do a conservation management planning exercise. And so in 2018, 19, 20, we called upon the services of the University of Pennsylvania's Conservation Division, Penn Praxis, to bring in a team to really pull together an assessment of the work to be done at the mission and to come up with their best assessments of the work to be done, the priorities, how they scaled the priorities. And so Starr Herr-Cardillo, who is now sitting on the screen in position 3, led a team. Her professor, Frank Matiro from University of Pennsylvania, led the team. Starr was a co-author. And so across the span of almost 20 months, they produced a very detailed assessment of the work still remaining at the mission and phased it according to a variety of parameters. And so once the East Tower project was finished, it's really given Starr and I an opportunity to go back in and begin using the conservation management planning tool to phase in the remaining pieces. And so what Starr is going to be introducing to you today, our assessment of the work that remains. And I'm going to close out with just a few bullets about how we perceive the amount of dollars that will be required. And it will kind of give you a sense, I think, of a timeline that's, well, I think pretty exciting. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the discussion over to Starr, who's going to work through the remaining projects and talk a little bit about some of the conservation values that are associated with some of those projects. Starr, take it away.
Great, thanks, Miles. Hi, everyone. I am going to apologize in advance because I'm recovering from COVID. I feel fine, but I have a persistent throat clearing that I have to do a lot. I hope it's not too bad during my presentation. Let me share my screen. All right, so I'm going to share some work that Miles and I have been really digging into over the past couple of months, thinking about long-range planning at San Xavier. What does sustainable care look like in the long term? Click. There we go. So one of the things we're really focused on moving forward is sort of thinking about maintenance. Like Miles said, you know, things have sort of been framed as these large, kind of daunting independent projects in the past, but the work never stops. There's a lot of maintenance that needs to happen at the mission. And so we're really tasked with trying to envision what that looks like and how do we make it financially sustainable. So I just wanted to start with a couple of definitions, just because maintenance can feel like kind of a general term, but when we're talking about it in this context, what we're really talking about is routine, cyclical, non-destructive actions necessary to slow deteriorations of a building. Keeping up with maintenance is the most cost-effective way to care for an older building, and it can help avoid costly interventions. And so a couple other terms we'll throw around. Deferred maintenance is maintenance or repairs that haven't been performed on schedule and have been put off into the future. Once maintenance becomes deferred maintenance, that work usually has to happen and becomes more involved than regular maintenance. And then emergency maintenance is work that needs to be done immediately for health, safety, or security reasons, addressing issues that are either threats to the public or to building users or the building itself. And so what we're working towards is getting on implementing a preventive conservation plan. So preventive conservation is considered measures that prevent damage or reduce the potential for damage. It's kind of a philosophy for sustainable management that's intended to avoid large, costly capital interventions and where you're mitigating effects of deterioration through monitoring and kind of staying up on top of that maintenance cycle. But it's important to realize that in order to begin a preventive conservation cycle, you need to address deferred maintenance, and all the building components need to be in a stable condition. So that's sort of how we're thinking of this long-range planning. And I'm going to go through some projects. It's not an exhaustive list of everything that's on our schedule, but the major projects that we've identified that are kind of big deferred maintenance projects. And the thinking is, you know, once those are addressed, what does the preventive maintenance cycle look like for those components? So all of this is part of our thinking on this planning process. So one of the first projects up is, you know, putting some final touches on the East Tower. We're working with a wood conservator who's helped conserve some of the original doors and the altar railing in the Mission to use historic photographs to design a historically accurate replica balcony for the East Tower balcony. The current balcony that's there, that's shown in the photo on the left, is actually a 1950s era replica, and it's very badly deteriorated, in part because of the type of wood that was used. It was actually repurposed railroad ties, oak railroad ties, and its exposure on this south-facing facade. It gets a ton of sun. And there hadn't been routine maintenance, so it's in pretty bad shape. The replica will be mesquite, which is a very durable wood. It's also what the balconies were originally made of. And while Luke is designing this balcony, he's also designing one for the center balcony which we can install when we get to working on the facade. Later on this summer, kind of beginning in August through maybe October, our conservators Tim Lewis, Matilde Rubio, and Susie Moreno will be working in the sacristy. And the sacristy is an interesting space because it has highly significant original finishes. It's one of the few places where you can see the original tricolor wainscoting. You can see that in the photo here. That's actually a lot more muted than in the 1950s overpainted wainscoting that you see in the rest of the church. It's also a space that serves a very practical purpose for the church and that gets heavily used, as you can see in the photo. So we're viewing our work in here as an opportunity to really work with church leadership and kind of clean this space up a bit. We'll care for the paintings by installing better protective barriers for the walls, making sure clutter isn't accumulating in those corners and damaging anything, removing redundant lighting and sound equipment, and hopefully just making the space more functional and more organized in partnership with the church at the same time. So this is kind of, I think this space really encapsulates the challenge of, you know, the fact that San Xavier is very much a living church. These spaces need to be protected, but they also need to be functional. And then after the sacristy, the next major interior project is the dome at the crossing, and that hasn't been conserved since that European crew came through in the 1990s. For this project, we're looking at bringing in a larger team of conservation technicians, so people who have experience working on murals and wall paintings, but who can work at the instruction of our own internal team of conservators, kind of following their protocols, with the goal of just expediting that process so that we can complete the project within 3 to 4 months. And the idea here is that ideally we'd like to get around to work on each section of the interior about once every 7 years or so. These paintings are super fragile, and you know, a lot of dust and environmental particles and things get into the church. It's really ideal to get in and clean and do that preventive maintenance on a more frequent schedule, you know, more frequent than the 25 years it's taken us to get back in here. But in order to do that, we really need to make sure that these projects can run efficiently and quickly and pose minimal disruption to the church. And then following that, we have the retablo facade, and maybe some of you attended our lecture on the facade. But that's a huge and really exciting project that we have lined up for fall of 2023. The facade was last treated in the 1950s, and a lot of what's visible today is repair from that work, that campaign. So our goal with this project is to remove any of the incompatible 1950s era repair, uncovering and stabilizing the remaining original finishes. And there is quite a bit of original finish left here, and it's an exciting project, but also one that comes with some technical challenges, just because the conditions we see here on the exterior, kind of a south-facing facade, are very different than the interior. It poses some challenges with creating a climate-controlled environment, which is helpful for some of the materials we might use. So we're looking to do a pilot test of conservation methods in the fall, late this year, hopefully after the sacristy, so October, November, December, which will give us a chance to kind of test out our approach on a larger section, give a better sense of the extent of work that lies ahead, help us do more accurate budgeting for the full project, and help us feel confident in our methods. It would also give the public a sense of how it will look, because this is sort of a big question for this. It's such a prominent element of the church. It's literally the face of the church, and we want people to feel very comfortable with what's happening. Then we have some smaller scale deferred maintenance projects that we think really lend themselves well to working maybe with smaller contractors, incorporating some public workshops. And those include doing repairs to the mortuary chapel. You can see there's some patching and repair that needs to happen at the bottom, where you see some basal erosion, plaster patching at the top cornice, and then repairing the cemetery wall. which is an unstabilized adobe wall dating to the early 1900s. And these are just kind of more straightforward projects that need to happen, but could be a great opportunity to bring in younger people looking to learn about adobe masonry and preservation. And we've started reaching out to potential partners for things like this and are hoping to build in some training elements.
Yeah, we've actually had a number of conversations with both the local university, San Miguel High School, the Patronato Community College, looking at how we might partner with those organizations to run training opportunities to really expose the world of conservation as sustainable job opportunities, so that we can get kids excited about learning some of these skills. So that's a really exciting spin-off that's becoming more and more apparent as we move forward.
Yeah, and then another important challenge is, now that the East Tower is complete and the exterior has pretty much all that Portland cement has been replaced with this breathable lime sand plaster, but we need to now think about what exterior maintenance looks like. So the photo I'm showing here is of the West Nave wall, which was one of the first sections that was stripped of cement and replastered in the late 80s, early 90s. So this plaster is now close to 30 years old. And while lime plaster can last a while, it needs to be maintained and replenished with a lime wash every 5 to 7 years or so. And I don't know, it's a little hard to see in this photo, but there's some web cracking that occurs. It's a natural process as the plaster expands and contracts with heat and changing temperature. And lime washing actually helps repair those cracks and slow deterioration and detachment of the plaster from the brick. We were investigating this area with our contractor, Eric Means, and with Bob Vint, just to sort of see how it's holding up and how urgent it is. And there actually is quite a bit of detachment on this wall. So this has moved up as a priority area. We're going to try to get it lime washed and repaired to kind of extend its life. But it's a good example of why getting on top of that regular maintenance cycle and a lime washing cycle is important for the rest of the exterior. So we don't go as long without maintenance, because the longer you put it off, the cost of going in and doing those repairs, and even if you eventually have to replace the plaster altogether, is just exponentially higher than doing some simple lime washing. So our goal is to, get the East Tower and other areas that are freshly done lime washed on the proper schedule. And then kind of anchoring, the later years of our long-term plan is stabilization of the museum and Grand John wings, which we kind of have tentatively slated for happening between 2025 and 2027. But a lot will depend on outcomes from the planning phase of this work. When we talk about the convento wings, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but we're talking about the this wing that borders faces the parking lot. As you walk up to the church, the museum wing currently houses our museum. And then we call this long wing that extends north the Grand John wing, because it was primarily built when Bishop Grand John was overseeing the mission. But there's really a lot of underutilized space in these wings. And so we see this project as an opportunity to really work closely with the church and try to do a lot of space and use planning and put some thought into how the campus is used and how it functions for them and how it functions for visitors and the public. And just, take an opportunity to make it a little more functional, allow us to better define kind of the public and private parts of the campus. But it's going to involve a lot of discussion and a lot of planning kind of leading up to this work. We do know that from a conservation standpoint, this space poses some challenges. It's an area that's evolved a lot over the years. It's made of mud adobe, and you can see in these early photos that it really resembles kind of a typical Sonoran row house, and the wings are just added to over time. They've really always been about functionality for the church and the operation of the church. So I think this photo's about circa 1880. Here's how it looks following Bishop Grandjohn's work. And you can see it looks a little more unified, but it still has that kind of Sonoran row house look. There's a better view of the north side, kind of during the Grandjohn era, I think maybe 1920s.
And we've talked about the fact that the bishop used to have an apartment there, and that odd horseshoe-shaped room was actually his bathroom.
Yeah, nice oval-shaped bathtub room. And then this is how it looks today. So we have a modern office wing that was added in the 1990s here, still used by the church. We have a mobile trailer here that kind of blocks your view of the north wing, but that functions as the classroom. And it's a little hard to see from the photo, but this north section, at least from the modern office block on, does kind of retain that early 1900s appearance where it looks a little bit like a row house. But the face that visitors are used to seeing, the south face, is interestingly really a product of a 1950s restoration, or quote unquote restoration. On the left here this is from a scrapbook that was put together by the architect who oversaw this work. And on the left, you can see how it looked before they began the project. They strip the building of its plaster. They describe finding some fairly silty, unstabilized mud adobe, staple it with chicken wire. They build up with modern brick and concrete masonry units, a door surround here, a chunky parapet, and then on the right is how it looks when they were finished. So it's sort of this romantic revival look that they felt was more unified with the church, but it's not historically accurate. An interesting thing is that, we know from preliminary conversations we've had, Miles and I, with the State Historic Preservation Office, that they're open to interpreting the period of significance here in different ways. So that's kind of it's a funny concept in preservation. Some people are moving away from it, but it's still standard practice to kind of define a period of time in which you're interpreting the building to. So for this building, SHPO basically said, oh, I think you could make a case that the period to interpret it to is the 1950s era, because it's the view that most people are familiar with, and that it's the way it's looked for the past 70 years now. That's considered historic in its own right. Or you could make a case for trying to take it back to an earlier version when the north wing was complete. And I just find that interesting because I don't know what the public would think. And actually, it would be nice to hear what people in this meeting think. If you have a strong reaction one way or another, we'd be curious to hear it, maybe in the Q&A.
Or perhaps in the chat.
Yeah, or put your feelings in the chat. Another really important component of that museum wing is the woodwork, specifically the vigas and the columns in the ceiling. And I think this might be a feature that a lot of visitors don't typically see. You'll see them in the museum rooms, but there's another small chapel where there's some really incredible engineering that's happening with these ceiling beams. And you can get a sense in this picture how they're using this large central beam to kind of support these smaller beams and span a really wide area. This is in the Zag one that's now used in the candle room. But so these are a really important component, and they've been heavily damaged by termites and other insects over the years. So that's on our radar too, as part of this project, kind of factoring in that this is going to be a big component of that work that's going to add significant cost and time. But re-envisioning those two wings really presents an opportunity, I think, to think about the campus holistically. And one of the issues that's come up that kind of relates to how visitors move through this space and how that circuit, the tourist or circulation pattern works is the restroom location, which are currently right off of the west door. So you go in through the front door of the church and people typically wind around and come out through the west door. Restrooms right here. This block to the right, where the word restrooms is painted, is an older restroom block that just kind of half functions as storage, but it limits access that would be useful for us. If we could eliminate this structure and bring in, say, a lift to do some of that lime washing work we were talking about, it'd be really helpful because accessing this side of the building is challenging. And it also sits on top of an archaeological site that down the line on our planning list is something that we hope to interpret one day. Also on the table is relocating the current restrooms, maybe sort of reimagining as part of this, rethinking the larger campus, thinking about, where does it make sense to put the restrooms and how does it make sense to have people move through the campus in a way that limits disruption to parishioners and to church users, and also is a little bit more intuitive or just makes a little more sense for the amount of visitation that happens here. So that's really all I have for my slides. There's quite a long list of smaller projects too, but I thought I'd focus on the big ones. So
thanks, Starr. It's great. Perhaps before we move on, we should throw it open for initial questions if anybody has them for Starr before we move on to the second part.
Sure.
And you're probably muted, so it may be best if you perhaps put comments in chat initially.
Let's see.
I have a simple comment. I'm Joey Adams, live in a home that was built in the 50s, and the front door looks just like the one on the church, but not like that. It's beautiful, but it's built like that. And I wanted to get up and go look at the blocks on the wood. It's very heavy, beautiful, well cared for. Okay. So it was interesting to see what's going on there.
Yeah, cool.
Any other comments? Then let me move over to look at so Starr has talked about how we spent a lot of time sort of thinking about where things would phase in across the coming years. And you might recall at the beginning of today's presentation, I had said how some years back, Bob Vint and Chuck Albanese had tried to do some projecting for us to kind of get a sense of what we were looking at across time. And at that point, we were looking at about $20 million, 20 years. I just wanted to kind of provide an update of where we think we are today. Of course, we're now 5-6 years on, but in terms of the projects that Starr's alluded to and taken us through in part today, we have started working on the preservation of doors. We have 2 more sets that will be done this year and a further set that will be done next year. So in all, we're looking at about $200,000 expenditure on the doors. Starr mentioned about the balconies. We have one that will be phased in as part of work this coming year, and then following on as part of the Façade project, the central balcony. And then we're also planning that there will be some reworking of the balcony on the west tower to integrate it with the other 2. And so we may be doing some modification of the rafters that the balcony sits on and perhaps replacing the spindles so that they are all aligned and matched. Across the coming 6 to 7 years, we see about another $800,000 being spent on maintaining the interior art. We're almost to a point that we have reached the point of the cyclical maintenance that Starr has talked about on the interior. Tim and Matilde have just finished, and I should say Susie as well, finished the west transept, doing a top to bottom redo of the work that took place in 1994, bringing that up to speed. The work in the domes is really going to accomplish the same in that area, and that leaves just sections of the nave to be done, as they've already worked on the main altar in the church. And their work 2 years ago in the choir loft, and then this fall in the sacristy, will really see much of the interior brought to the level that Starr referred to, where we're into preventive maintenance. We see the facade project running about $750,000. We're projecting now, because there's still a lot of research to be done on both the convento and the Granjon era wings, but we're assuming probably 2 million for the convento, perhaps 1.5 million for the Granjon era wing, and then other ancillary tasks that Starr alluded to, work on the mortuary chapel, the walls, and other smaller tasks. And then there are certain projects that are not included on the master list. For example, one of the long delayed thoughts has been what could be done about heating and cooling in the church. Any of you that have gone to the concerts on a cold winter evening in winter know that that church can be very, very chilly on occasions. And if you've ever been there in the heat of summer, even though it's a beautiful thick adobe building, by the time you get 100+ bodies in there, it can quickly get stifling and overwhelming. So one of the deferred projects is, could anything be done to ameliorate heating and cooling issues within the building without, of course, damaging the very fragile painted surfaces? Starr mentioned about redoing the restrooms. We need an electrical assessment to really upgrade the lighting. There's been some discussion about solar on the campus at the Mission. Additional wooden elements, for example, all around the cloisters, the beams in those areas are in need of work, just like the work that you saw that is needed to be done in the convento wing. The transept floors, the Granjon gate. So all up, we're looking at projects that total about $420,000 that weren't on the original list. But if we say in round numbers that we're looking perhaps at another $1 million worth of supplementary projects, our assessment when we look at our planning across subsequent years, and I should tell you that 22, 23 and 23, 24, those are big numbers, but in fact, we've already banked considerable amounts of money towards the projects that Starr has talked about. So one of the things that we're moving toward is a period of more conservative thinking about how we launch projects, that we want to see the money identified prior to actually launching a project. And so the work in the domes we have almost covered. The sacristy project is covered completely. Several of the doors that will be done this year, next year are partly paid for. And we're also building resources to be able to attack the facade in fall of next year. So the good news is that we are in a position with all of the work that's been done to date and the existence of a well thought through conservation management plan, that we are in a fine position to go back to granting sources, which we haven't been able to do very successfully for some time. In fact, this Sacred Places grant was the first that we'd had in a decade to be able to help us significantly with a major project. So the good news is we think that we're looking at across the next 7 to 8 years, projects that should run just a little under $7 million. And so our projections for the future is, rather than that 20 by 20 program that was being talked about 7 years ago, we're now looking at maybe 7 years to complete the deferred maintenance at the Mission site, and perhaps around $7 million. So we're feeling pretty excited about this being a really well thought through path to get us to a point at the Mission where a lot of these deferred projects are things of the past. And the other part that we will be doing is continuing to build our permanent endowment. At the present time, that sits at about $1.7 million, and it's currently yielding a chunk of money that we put towards conservation of the interior artwork. But as that builds across time, we see that as being the path to helping with the kinds of preventive maintenance that Starr has underscored as being the goal for the future, that our endowment we see as being sort of the path to providing a good deal of the funding that will be needed to keep that work going indefinitely. So we just wanted to bring you up to speed with this presentation, which we gave to the board about this time last month. And so there's a great deal of excitement at Patronato at the moment that we kind of can sort of feel and taste the end of these major projects. And a lot of the thanks goes to people on this Zoom meeting with us today, because a great many of you people have been there throughout many years, providing the kinds of support that has allowed us to reach this really great position. So that said, I'm going to start my share and see if there are any questions that people have for us today.
I think it's a lot to take in, you know, for after the East Tower being a long process. It's a little bit like moving at warp speed, I think, you know.
That's true. I mean, we were really looking at 11 years to be able to pull off the East Tower project. And so I think we've learned a lot, and it's going to really impact how we move forward.
Miles, I have a question. This is Fred Frelinghuysen.
Uh-huh.
I was interested to see the table with the numbers, and some pretty big numbers for the convento and that sort of thing. How urgent in terms of maintenance are those projects? Are we going to lose ground if they aren't done on schedule?
I think that the most urgent is the convento wing, and Starr, help me here if you see it differently. We know that the actual structure itself, you know, just the nature of the deteriorating adobe, which is sun-dried rather than the burned adobe that was used in the mission proper, makes it much more vulnerable. We do plan to do some exploratory exercises in the next 6 to 18 months to really assess what's going on behind the plaster in those sections. We also know that the wood is long overdue for remediation, and as part of that, we're actually training a new apprentice who will be starting with us to really focus in on learning some of the conservation values for treating wood, so that he can begin addressing those sections specifically.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, they are, I think when we tentatively scheduled them for 2025 could be a little bit ambitious. I mean, I think we gave ourselves some flexibility there. I don't see there being like imminent issues, but it's just been known that it's an issue for a long time, and kind of typical of a lot of adobe buildings in the Southwest. If you go up and sound the wall, it's very clear that there's a lot of detachment, and that kind of once we open that can of worms, that's going to be a big project. So yeah, definitely a priority. And I think as far as, you know, what's seen attention on the campus, those areas have really kind of taken the back seat for a really long time.
And I think too, the other issue is the usage of those rooms, because I think that's where the bulk of work needs to begin immediately, is really talking with church personnel about what would be the best function of some of those spaces. I mean, you have in the Grand John era wing, there's a small apartment right in the middle that's used for the friars when their families come to visit. Right next door to that is a maintenance shed, and beyond that, 2 classrooms, both of which have incredibly tall ceilings so that they are like a heat sink in the winter. And so best use is really going to be something that we really need to talk through. There's long been discussion about should there be some kind of kitchen facility there that would allow the patio to take on a different kind of purpose and function for the mission. And so all of these, I think, are discussions that if we begin now, we may be in a position to have some really solid planning in place by 2025, 26, when these buildings come on stream for refurbishing.
Miles, Mike Hickey is asking, a large amount is invested, and with the global market sinking, what is this extra cash invested in?
You mean the endowment?
Just how do we have everything invested during this time when the markets are sinking?
Well, we currently work with investors out of Merrill Lynch who take a relatively cautious approach. So it's a combination of equities and bonds. And our finance committee have a separate division that meets with those advisors periodically to do readjustments of the accounts. And to date, you know, that we've done incredibly well with our investments. And in terms of, you know, the amount of money that we take off our investments, that too is somewhat cautious. The goal is to be building the corpus, not actually chipping into the corpus of the investment accounts. I don't know whether that.
I think Mike is just sort of saying that all the markets are down this year. So how do we expect to manage through that?
You know, I think this is something that I would need to refer back to our finance committee for their position. I mean, there's always a determination that we could choose not to take money out of our investment account if we felt like it was going to impact the corpus of those investments.
So Michael, we'll get back to you with a better answer if that's okay with you. And I think maybe we can address Squirrel Lovelady's question, which was how will the new balconies look compared to what's there at this time?
That's a good question, Squirrel. I think the answer is that there'll be subtle differences, probably to most people looking from as far away as that one experiences a mission. The differences will be subtle, but Luke and his team are working forensically with photographs to get a better sense of how the original spindles looked. We know that they were built to sort of geometric formulas that Luke had identified when he was working on the railings of the altar. And you know, there were particular traditions used by the craftsmen at that time in terms of the way in which they used the lathe to shape the various spindles. And so I think the goal is to take them, to make a reproduction that's much, much closer to the originals. We believe that many of the spindles that are on the current ones were probably purchased off the rack at something like Home Depot or whatever the 1950s equivalent was, so that there really wasn't an attempt to make them historically accurate, but rather to replicate using materials that were freely available. I think the other thing is that he's looking to use original timbers. The sense is that native mesquite, if it's dried properly, is an incredibly durable wood, and given the exposure that these pieces receive from the southern sun, there's a goal to certainly make these reproductions much more durable.
And I'll just say one very fun discovery in that I showed you pages from that scrapbook that showed work on the convento wing. There's, I don't know, it's probably the whole scrapbook is 20, 25 pages or so. And there's an image showing lintels in a window in the convento and identifying the wooden lintels as repurposed corbels from the balcony. So we went inside and we were able to find that window. So we actually do have some of the original balcony beams on site. They've just been repurposed, but we can take dimensions from them and kind of Luke could inspect them closer and verify that they are mesquite. And that was just kind of a neat find.
Great.
Any other questions? Well, it sounds like we've managed the impossible. We've squeezed what took us 3 hours to present to the board into less than an hour. So I would say the good news is that we can release you to the rest of your day, but we really appreciate you joining us today on this Friends of Patronato lecture to find out more about planning across the next decade at the mission. We look forward to seeing you on our next presentation.
Thank you, Miles.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Kim.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.